Good to see you this morning. Y'all don't seem too happy to see me. So good to see y'all this morning. Oh, that's funny. How do you live out faith in a hostile world? And sometimes we look at this world and we think that this world is not hostile. But in reality, if we take a good look at the text and a good look at Jesus, a good look at the life that He lived, good look at the things that He taught us, there are some things about this world that are hostile to faith in Jesus. You don't have to look very hard in modern media to find some things, do you? There are instances almost every day when you look at a newspaper, which probably very few of you ever do anymore. But when you start to read the online news or you check out the major headlines, it's not unusual that there's some controversy about someone who took a moral stand on something and then they're being sued, they're being ridiculed, they're being talked about, they're being maligned because they took a stand in our world. You don't have to look very hard, to be very honest, and say public opinion for Christianity is actually declining, it seems. You don't have to look very hard to see that ideas about religion and organized religion and churches are declining in some ways. We look out and we see tragedy in some ways. Almost in our own city, in Nashville, Burnett Chapel Church of Christ, not long ago, there was a shooting. Something that 10, 20, 30 years ago might have been almost unheard of. If you think about trying to merge the church and the world, any attempt to do that, to make them exactly the same or even close to the same, is simply probably doomed to failure. We're going to be tested. We're going to be tried. There will be times in our life that we're called on to stand up for Jesus in a way that probably and most likely will bring us some kind of ridicule. There was a person, Dr. A.T. Pearson, and one occasion someone asked, "Don't you think that the world is getting converted already?" And he said, "Well, I admit that the world has become a little churchy, but the church has become immensely worldly." And that's something that we have to fight against, to make sure that we're making a stand for Jesus and we're placing our faith and our love and our trust in Him. We're looking at letters that were written to churches in Revelation. So if you turn to Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. Revelation chapter 2, verse 8. "And to the angel of the church in Smyrna write, These are the words of Him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. I know your afflictions and your poverty, yet you are rich. I know the slander of those who say they are Jews but are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. Do not be afraid of what you are about to suffer. I tell you, the devil will put some of you in prison to test you, and you will suffer persecution for 10 days. Be faithful, even to the point of death, and I will give you the crown of life. He who has an ear, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. He who overcomes will not be hurt by the second death." If you look at the map, Smyrna is located just a little bit north of Ephesus, which we talked about last week. Here's Ephesus. Smyrna is a little bit north of that. And when Jesus said the one who died and came to life again, Smyrna as a city had died. It had been almost totally destroyed. And then as time progressed, it became a recognized kind of an important city again. And millions, just thousands and thousands, in our terminology, for adjusted for inflation, millions of dollars would have been spent rebuilding Smyrna. And it became one of the most beautiful cities in that area. The way that the cities were the buildings were built on top of the hill there, it was called like a crown, which is very interesting when he talks about the crown of life. Someone in Smyrna would have understood that very well. I don't know when the church in Smyrna got started. We don't have any indication of that in the text, but we know that there was a church there and that existed there. And that church in Smyrna was undergoing tribulation. persecution. It was undergoing problems. The word that we translate tribulation there means very literally pressure. In a medical way, it's used for the pulse. So that kind of tribulation is the kind of pressure that's attached to something to squash it, to afflict it, to harass it, to attempt to destroy it. And we probably ought to expect tribulation in every generation. Very honestly, when we look at what the church should endure in this world, there shouldn't be a generation that stands for Jesus that doesn't have some type of tribulation. He knew their tribulation and their poverty. This word for poverty means someone who is just so very destitute that for the basic necessities of life, they have to resort to begging. It's not poverty in the sense of someone who is poor and they have to work for a living so that they can pay their own way. This is someone who is so destitute that the only way they could get the things that they need for life is to set out and to beg. And you might ask, well, how did people in the church get that destitute? Very likely they had confiscation of their property because they were Christians. That they would come in, the government would come in and take over the things that they had. It could be that they lost their jobs because of their faith. So this is a kind of pressure, kind of tribulation that we would look at in our world and say, you know, that just doesn't kind of seem right. And you're right, it wasn't right. But it's what they were enduring for the sake of the church. Some of you will be thrown into prison. Now, they're not thrown into prison because they're bad people in a biblical standpoint. They're thrown into prison because they're believers in Jesus. That happens all over our world, but not so much in our own community. People who are put into prison are even forced to lose their life because of the faith that they have in Jesus. This is not just a little bit of pressure. This is a kind of pressure that can choke the life out of someone. If you read some things about the first and the second century, here are some things that Christians were accused of. Not rightfully so, but were accused of. In some ways, they were accused of cannibalism because they talked about eating the body and drinking the blood. For those who didn't understand the significance of the Lord's Supper, something that we just participated in, that somebody on the outside would look at that and say, that teaching about eating body and drinking blood, then they're cannibalists. They had love feast. And because of love feast, they were accused of immorality, especially sexual immorality, because of a love feast. They didn't accept Greek gods, so they were accused of atheism. They spoke so much about fire of the Spirit and divine judgment, in some cases they were accused of being arsonists. They were unwilling to pay homage to Caesar as Lord, so they were accused of being disloyal to Rome. They were so intensely loyal and dedicated to demonstrating love to one another that particularly Jewish families would often disown those who had converted to Christianity, so that they were charged with splitting families. And the world at large as a whole didn't look upon them with favor. It's very interesting when you look at some of that as far as emperor worship, some of the Jewish people were exempt from that because it was a recognized type of religion. And so those who were the synagogue of Satan, those who were Jews in name only, could have been those who, as we'll look at an example in a few minutes, who, in the case of Polycarp, helped gather wood so that they could burn him. Or maybe even Christians who, in order to not endure the persecution that they were going to endure, would maybe in some way pledge some type of allegiance to Judaism so that they could escape judgment. And Jesus, even while he was on the earth, says, in this world you will have tribulation. But be courageous. I have overcome the world. Do you realize there's not one place in there where Jesus says that because of your faith in Him, you're going to be spared from tribulation because of the faith that you have in Him? He never chooses to take it away. It becomes a test. In the letter to Smyrna, do you find it interesting that he never said, oh, and by the way, I'm just going to take this away so that you don't need to endure that? No, he didn't. He said, you are going to be tested. You're going to be tried. You will find out if your faith is real. So how do we see that in our world? Satan is the instigator of all tribulation and persecution against the church. Do you realize that? Do you realize that whatever is happening in our world, there is something behind that that is so much greater and bigger than the thing that we're enduring? That there is a spiritual battle going on and we are caught right in the middle of it? Do you realize there are always going to be people who stir up trouble if we take a moral stance against something? Do you realize there's always going to be something that happens if we choose to stand up and say, we believe that Jesus Christ is Lord? There will always be somebody on this earth who opposes us. We should never be without opposition until Satan is crushed and destroyed. Remember those words to Smyrna? Satan is going to cast some of you into prison. Do you think Satan's still attacking you because you believe that Jesus is the Son of God? He is. Do you think he's just going to leave you alone? Do you think he's just going to look out there and say, well, you know what, I'll just leave that church alone because of the faith that they have? And it's not going to happen that way. Should you be surprised when you pick up a newspaper or you look online or you hear somebody say something negative about Christ Church? No. Because the world and the church will never be on the same page. It's not designed that way. Jesus knew that it wouldn't be that way. But how do we respond to all of that? How do we respond to those who speak out against us? We treat them all with love and respect. We treat them the way Jesus treated those who opposed Him. I don't take up arms. I don't lash out against them. I don't treat them with disrespect. Judgment is not mine. I love them. The way Jesus loved those who opposed Him. Remember verses in the Bible like, live such good lives among the pagans that though they speak evil of you, they glorify God on the day that He visits? That's my challenge. My challenge is to live out the love of Jesus in a hostile world that doesn't understand who I am. My challenge is to go out into this world and be a light of Christ to a world who doesn't even understand that they need Jesus. My challenge is to go out into the world so that when people see us and see the way we interact with others, that they glorify God because of the faith in Christ that we have in our hearts. We do the very opposite of what the world expects. We do good to those who seek to harm us. Now that sounds very unnatural, doesn't it? Seems very unnatural. But I operate in this world in a way that shows the love of Jesus, who endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. A Jesus who, in spite of everything that was done to Him, responded with love and tenderness and compassion and kindness. That's the type of example, that's the type of life that I try to live. Remember the slide before this? Who's trying to oppose us at every turn? Satan. What do I want for those who oppose me? For those who seek to oppose my walk in Jesus, what would I want for them in the very essence of my soul? What I want for them is salvation. What do I want for someone who stands up and says, I don't believe that Jesus is the Son of God, or who teaches otherwise? I want him to come to a realization that Jesus is the Son of God. I want to respond to him or her in love. Not oppose, not fight against, not defend. I want them to find relationship to God. So Paul, who experienced suffering, wrote things like this: For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing to the glory that is to be revealed in us. So it's temporary. Our suffering doesn't last forever. I should respond to that in some ways in a joyful way. Oh yeah, there can be tribulation on this world. How does that compare to the glory that God is going to reveal in us at the coming of Jesus? Hey, it's really kind of insignificant. Now, I know when we're going through it, it seems very difficult, doesn't it? So we have to keep this eternal perspective in mind. So Peter writes, Beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon to test you, as though something strange were happening to you, but rejoice insofar as you share Christ's sufferings, that you may also rejoice and be glad when his glory is revealed. If you are insulted for the name of Christ, you are blessed, because the Spirit of glory and of God rest upon you. But let none of you suffer as a murderer or a thief or an evildoer or as a meddler. Yet if any suffers as a Christian, let him not be ashamed, but let him glorify God in that name. Don't be surprised. So if I'm going to suffer simply because I profess the name of Jesus and I live out life the way that Jesus lived out his life, if I suffer for standing up for Christ in a moral standard, for what he taught, how should I respond to that? Joyfully. Being excited that I'm allowed to suffer for the sake of Christ's name. Because it's temporary. It doesn't last forever. Some of you will be tested for 10 days. I know we read that passage and think, man, why in the world 10 days? Well, I'll give you my best shot, all right? There's no other 10 days in Revelation, so we can't really pull anything from the book itself. There are a couple of things that did happen in 10 days. Do you remember back in the Old Testament with Daniel, when Daniel was going to be tested, he said, don't let me eat this kind of food, but let me eat food that God approves of, and you can test us. That testing lasted 10 days. So it's probably figuratively meant to be a short period of time, kind of a defined period of time that has an end, that has a conclusion. It doesn't last forever. We endure it for a while. And while we're on this world, it's very likely that if we have faith in Jesus, that we will endure suffering. In fact, we should expect to endure suffering. We should expect that the world's not going to agree with everything that we have to say. We ought to expect that the world's not going to like everything that we do. The world is not going to appreciate everything that we have to teach. The world's just not going to sit up and pay attention every time that we talk. The world is not going to embrace the things that we think are the core values of human life. The world in general is just not going to agree with us. Much like it did not in Smyrna. Had government-type persecution on one side, you had religious persecution on the other side, and you had these Christians in the church at Smyrna who were caught in the middle. And God very clearly says, I'm not going to take that away, but that's going to test you. See, the line between temptation and testing is like really thin. It's really thin. Satan is going to use it to tempt you. He's going to use it to try to get you to renounce your faith in Jesus. God is going to use it as an opportunity to test you, to strengthen you, to make your faith stronger, to increase your resolve. He's going to use it to kind of sift out all of those things in life that really aren't that important and kind of help you remember the things that are very much the most important. And so the promise is that we have a crown of life, not some king's crown, okay? We have a crown of life. It is a victor's crown. It is a type of crown that you would get when you ran a race and you won. It was usually some type of leaf crown that would be woven together. That is the promise that you will receive that type of crown. And what will you do with it? So blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. He remains steadfast under trial. He remains steadfast, same word that we use for this tribulation. He remains steadfast under tribulation, so that when he stood the test, a word that kind of means what your true colors are. In our culture, we say when the rubber meets the road, right? When it gets down to really finding out what you're made of. What are you really like? And when you've stood that trial, that temptation, that tribulation, and you stood the test, you've been proved to be faithful. Therefore, do not let those who suffer according to God's will entrust their souls to a faithful Creator while doing good. That's our challenge. We trust our souls to God while doing good, even while enduring tribulation. After Paul writes this letter to Smyrna, there is a bishop of the church of Smyrna, roughly a little less than 100 years later, named Polycarp. I often wondered if Polycarp in his time of trial just kind of reflected on the words that were shared with him. Maybe it probably wasn't 100 years, because he may have even heard these words read. Polycarp was being pressured to worship the emperor. They had gone out on a search for him. He was kind of in hiding, but didn't really want to be in hiding. They captured somebody who knew Polycarp, tortured him till they told him where Polycarp was, and so they went to capture Polycarp. He was maybe what they considered quite a prize, someone who was fairly high up in the church. They were trying to get him to worship the emperor. And he said, if you think I will swear by the genius of Caesar, then you don't know who I am. Hear me clearly. I am a Christian. So they threatened. They tried giving him second chances. Until finally Polycarp said, 86 years have I served Christ, and nor has he ever done me any harm. How then could I blaspheme my King who saved me? I bless thee for deeming me worthy of this day and this hour, that I may be among thy martyrs and drink the cup of my Lord Jesus Christ. So in spite of all of their efforts, threatening death to Polycarp, he surrendered himself to being burned at the stake, being burned by fire. And it said in some contemporary, some first century writings, and that even the Jews rushed out to grab wood to throw on the fire to burn Polycarp. And they did. To the point that they didn't want the Christians to be able to have his body, for fear that they might consider it something great. Polycarp in Smyrna Be faithful to the point of death. I wonder if those words were ringing in his ears. I've often wondered if I would make an excuse for that. Maybe if I do it, but I say I don't really mean it. For Polycarp, no. How will you endure tribulation? Number one, expect it. Number two, realize who's behind it. Number three, realize the promise that you have in Jesus. And number four, whatever God calls on you to do, you be faithful to the point of death. Be faithful to the point of becoming his disciple. Be willing to stand up before your family and your friends and be able to proclaim, I believe Jesus is the Son of God. Become a follower. Don't be afraid. Do not be afraid of what this world can do to you. To the one who overcomes will never in any way be harmed by the second death. There is no stronger way to say it's not going to happen than the one John used. The one who overcomes will never in any way, under any possibility, for any reason, ever be harmed by the second death. Be faithful and find life in Jesus Christ. If you need to respond in some way, we're going to ask you to do that while we stand and sing.